In March 2019, an unprecedented event shook the global aviation industry, the worldwide grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX fleet. This decision, made by regulators across the globe, followed two catastrophic crashes within 5 months: Lion Air Flight 610 in October 2018 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 in March 2019. Together, these disasters claimed 346 lives, initiating a profound crisis for Boeing, a titan of American manufacturing. What emerged from the subsequent investigations was a complex narrative of engineering compromises and corporate pressures. The 737 MAX was designed to be Boeing's most successful aircraft yet, the latest evolution of a half-century-old design. For decades, the 737 series had been a reliable workhorse, becoming the best-selling commercial airliner in history. The MAX, launched in 2011, promised greater fuel efficiency and range, intended to keep Boeing competitive against its European rival, Airbus, and their new A320neo. This commitment to an existing airframe, however, would introduce a series of engineering challenges that demanded innovative, though ultimately flawed, solutions. The pressure on Boeing was immense. Airbus had launched its A320neo, an updated version of its popular single-aisle jet, featuring new, more fuel-efficient engines. Airlines were quickly placing orders. Boeing responded with the 737 MAX program in 2011, but instead of designing an entirely new aircraft, they opted to update the existing 737 airframe. This decision was driven largely by a desire to bring the MAX to market quickly and, crucially, to minimize costs associated with pilot retraining. To match the A320neo's fuel efficiency, Boeing needed to equip the MAX with larger, more powerful CFM LEAP-1B engines. However, the 737's low-slung design meant these larger engines couldn't be simply placed under the wings. Engineers had to mount them further forward and higher up than on previous 737 models. This seemingly minor adjustment had significant aerodynamic consequences, fundamentally altering how the aircraft behaved, particularly at high angles of attack. The repositioned engines, particularly their larger nacelles, generated additional lift at higher angles of attack, or AOA. This changed the aircraft's pitch characteristics, causing the nose to tend upwards more aggressively than previous 737 models. According to Boeing's own analysis, if the pilot were to fly the aircraft at a high AOA with flaps up, the MAX nose would tend to pitch up, increasing the risk of an aerodynamic stall. This was an unacceptable change in handling for an aircraft meant to inherit the 737 name. To counteract this new aerodynamic tendency, Boeing introduced the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. This automated software system was designed to push the aircraft's nose down under specific flight conditions. According to Boeing, MCAS was intended to make the 737 MAX handle like previous 737 models, ensuring that pilots transitioning to the new aircraft would find its behavior familiar and predictable, eliminating the need for extensive, costly retraining. The avoidance of extensive pilot retraining was a central tenet of the MAX program. Regulators typically require significant training for new aircraft types, but Boeing argued the MAX was merely a variant of the existing 737, not a new aircraft. This classification meant pilots only needed supplemental computer-based training, not costly, time-consuming simulator sessions. Introducing a complex system like MCAS, which fundamentally altered flight control, risked undermining this crucial competitive advantage. The initial design of MCAS had a critical flaw: it relied on input from a single angle of attack, AOA, sensor. Modern airliners typically use multiple redundant sensors for critical flight parameters, comparing their readings to ensure accuracy and detect malfunctions. However, MCAS, in its initial iteration, did not incorporate this redundancy. If that single AOA sensor provided erroneous data, MCAS would activate based on false information, potentially commanding the aircraft's nose down without the pilot's input or awareness. Even more concerning, the original design of MCAS allowed it to repeatedly push the nose down, overriding pilot inputs, without the pilot being fully aware of the system's function or how to counteract it. This aggressive behavior, triggered by a single faulty sensor, created a scenario where pilots could effectively be fighting against their own aircraft's automated system, unaware of the underlying cause. This lack of clear disclosure about MCAS's existence and behavior would prove devastating. Driven by the imperative to avoid pilot retraining, Boeing made critical decisions regarding the disclosure of MCAS. The system's details were not included in the standard flight manuals or pilot training materials for the 737 MAX. Boeing believed MCAS would operate transparently in the background, making the MAX feel like a 737 NG, thus not requiring explicit pilot knowledge. This lack of disclosure, according to subsequent investigations, deprived pilots of vital information necessary to understand and react to a system malfunction. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, certified the 737 MAX in 2017. Investigations later revealed that the FAA delegated significant portions of the certification process to Boeing itself, a practice known as Organizational Designation Authorization, ODA. While common, critics argued this practice created a conflict of interest, where Boeing employees, acting as de facto FAA representatives, reviewed their own company's designs. This arrangement, combined with the pressure to accelerate certification, raised questions about the thoroughness of the safety oversight. During certification, the FAA's understanding of MCAS's full capabilities and potential risks was, according to some reports, incomplete. Early versions of Boeing's safety assessments for MCAS indicated it was a relatively benign system, operating only at high AOA and not requiring explicit pilot knowledge. The system's potential to command repeated nose-down inputs, overriding pilot actions, was not fully appreciated or documented in a way that prompted deeper scrutiny during the initial certification phase. Airlines purchasing the 737 MAX were also largely unaware of MCAS. Their pilots, trained on the existing 737 NG models, were introduced to the MAX with minimal additional training, consistent with Boeing's messaging that it handled identically. The system, which could fundamentally alter flight control in an emergency, was a hidden variable in their operations. This lack of transparency meant that when problems arose, pilots would be reacting to an unfamiliar and undocumented system behavior, drastically escalating the danger. On October 29, 2018, just over a year after its certification, the tragic consequences of these decisions began to unfold. Lion Air Flight 610, a brand new 737 MAX 8, crashed into the Java Sea shortly after takeoff from Jakarta, Indonesia, killing all 189 people on board. Initial data showed erratic flight paths, with the aircraft repeatedly pitching its nose down, then up, in a desperate struggle for control. The flight recorder data painted a grim picture of pilots fighting against an automated system. Flight data recorders from Lion Air JT610 revealed that an angle of attack sensor on the left side of the aircraft was providing faulty data from the moment of takeoff. This erroneous input triggered MCAS multiple times, repeatedly pushing the aircraft's nose down. The pilots, unaware of MCAS or its behavior, struggled for control, using the trim switches to pitch the nose up, only for MCAS to re-engage and force the nose down again. This cycle repeated for approximately 11 minutes. Following the Lion Air crash, investigators immediately focused on MCAS. Boeing, while cooperating with investigations, initially emphasized existing pilot procedures for runaway trim, rather than the system's design. They issued an Operations Manual Bulletin, or OMB, advising pilots on how to handle uncommanded nose-down trim. However, this bulletin did not explicitly mention MCAS by name, nor did it fully explain the system's aggressive nature or the single point of failure that triggered it. Critics argued that Boeing's post-Lion Air response still fell short of adequately informing pilots about MCAS's unique characteristics. The OMB assumed pilots would recognize the runaway trim scenario and apply standard procedures. However, MCAS's repeated, automated commands were different from a typical mechanical runaway trim, and without knowledge of MCAS, pilots lacked the crucial context to diagnose the issue quickly. The fundamental design choice to keep MCAS undocumented continued to create a dangerous information gap. Just over 4 months later, on March 10, 2019, tragedy struck again. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another 737 MAX 8, crashed 6 minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa, killing all 157 people aboard. The similarities to the Lion Air crash were chillingly immediate. Investigators quickly recovered the flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorder, revealing a terrifying repeat of the previous disaster: erroneous AOA sensor input, followed by MCAS repeatedly forcing the aircraft's nose down. The flight data from Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 showed that the pilots had followed the emergency procedures outlined in Boeing's post-Lion Air bulletin, attempting to counteract the nose-down commands. However, the system's aggressive and repeated activation, triggered by the same single faulty AOA sensor, proved overwhelming. Despite their best efforts, the pilots were unable to regain control. The aircraft ultimately entered an unrecoverable dive, highlighting the inadequacy of both the system's design and the training provided. The second crash, with its undeniable similarities to the first, triggered an immediate and widespread crisis of confidence. Initially, the FAA resisted grounding the fleet, stating there was no basis to do so. However, as more nations independently grounded their 737 MAX fleets, led by China, followed by Europe, Canada, and others, the pressure became immense. On March 13, 2019, the FAA finally issued an emergency order grounding all Boeing 737 MAX aircraft in U.S. airspace, effectively grounding the entire global fleet. With both crashes definitively linked to MCAS, global investigations intensified, scrutinizing every aspect of the system's design, certification, and disclosure. The focus was squarely on the engineering trade-off, using software to compensate for an aerodynamic issue, and then relying on a single sensor without adequate redundancy. This design decision, driven by the desire to avoid pilot retraining and accelerate market entry, was now identified as the direct cause of 346 fatalities. A critical finding across investigations was the absence of redundancy for the AOA sensor feeding MCAS. While the 737 MAX had 2 AOA sensors, MCAS was designed to only use one for its inputs. An AOA disagree light, which would have warned pilots of a discrepancy between the two sensors, was an optional extra feature that many airlines did not purchase. This meant a single faulty sensor could activate MCAS without any explicit warning to the flight crew, a design choice that proved fatal. Investigations by various bodies, including the U.S. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, revealed deep corporate pressure within Boeing. Internal communications showed engineers expressing concerns about MCAS and the lack of pilot training. Yet, management, under intense pressure to compete with Airbus and meet the deadline for a common type rating with previous 737 models, pushed forward with the minimal disclosure strategy. This trade-off between safety and market imperatives became glaringly evident. The common type rating meant that a pilot qualified to fly a previous 737 model, like the 737NG, would also be qualified to fly the 737 MAX with minimal additional training. This was a massive selling point for airlines, saving them millions in training costs and reducing disruption. Boeing's design and disclosure decisions, including the understated role of MCAS, were inextricably linked to preserving this common type rating, even at the expense of comprehensive pilot awareness and safety redundancy. The FAA also came under intense scrutiny for its oversight during the 737 MAX certification. Critics argued that the agency's reliance on the ODA program, combined with a diminished staff and increasing workload, contributed to deficiencies in the review process. Documents revealed that FAA engineers were not always fully aware of the extent and behavior of MCAS, trusting Boeing's assessments. This raised serious questions about the effectiveness of self-regulation in such a critical industry. To address the root cause, Boeing embarked on a major software overhaul for MCAS. The updated system now takes input from both AOA sensors, comparing their readings. If there's a significant discrepancy, MCAS will be disabled. Furthermore, MCAS will only activate once, rather than repeatedly, and its authority to pitch the nose down has been limited. These changes aim to eliminate the single point of failure and prevent uncommanded, overwhelming nose-down inputs, alongside mandatory pilot training updates. Beyond software, Boeing and the FAA mandated new, extensive pilot training for the 737 MAX. This now includes simulator sessions focusing specifically on MCAS operation, failure modes, and recovery procedures. This represents a significant departure from Boeing's initial strategy of minimizing training, acknowledging that the system's complexities required explicit pilot knowledge and hands-on experience to safely manage. The trade-off between training costs and safety had been tragically re-evaluated. After nearly 2 years of grounding, extensive software updates, and new safety protocols, the Boeing 737 MAX began to be recertified by regulatory authorities worldwide. The FAA lifted its grounding order in November 2020, followed by other global regulators. Airlines gradually brought their MAX fleets back into service, often with public demonstrations of confidence and new passenger assurances. This lengthy process aimed to restore public trust, but the scars of the grounding and the lives lost remained a stark reminder. The 737 MAX crisis has permanently altered the landscape of aviation regulation and corporate design practices. It led to increased scrutiny of the FAA's certification processes, more international cooperation among regulators, and a re-evaluation of how automated systems are integrated and disclosed to pilots. For Boeing, the crisis resulted in billions in financial losses, a damaged reputation, and significant changes in its leadership and safety culture, underscoring the severe consequences of design trade-offs. At the heart of the 737 MAX story is an engineering compromise, a software solution, MCAS, designed to compensate for an aerodynamic change caused by larger engines. This software, intended to bridge the gap between an old airframe and new requirements, was then constrained by corporate pressures. The decision to rely on a single sensor without robust redundancy, and to minimize pilot disclosure, was a direct consequence of the imperative to avoid costly retraining and maintain a competitive edge. The non-disclosure of MCAS's full functionality and failure modes to pilots proved to be a fatal decision. Pilots, the final line of defense, were deprived of the knowledge necessary to effectively respond to an emergency initiated by a faulty sensor. This information gap was a direct outcome of the trade-off to certify the MAX as a variant requiring minimal pilot training, rather than a new aircraft type with comprehensive retraining. The human cost of this decision was immense. The crisis unequivocally underscored the imperative of redundancy in critical flight systems. Modern aviation safety relies on multiple layers of protection, ensuring that the failure of one component does not lead to catastrophic outcomes. The reliance of MCAS on a single angle of attack sensor, without cross-checking or immediate pilot alerts for discrepancies, was a deviation from established safety principles, a vulnerability that became tragically evident in the skies over Indonesia and Ethiopia. The 737 MAX grounding forced a global re-evaluation of aviation safety. It highlighted the delicate balance between innovation, market pressures, and regulatory oversight. Moving forward, regulators and manufacturers faced the challenge of ensuring that technological advancements, particularly in automated systems, are rigorously tested, fully understood, and transparently communicated to the pilots who ultimately bear responsibility for the lives on board. The lessons learned from the MAX will undoubtedly shape the future of air travel. Ultimately, the Boeing 737 MAX crisis is a story of the human factor, of engineers making design decisions, corporate executives navigating competitive pressures, and regulators overseeing a complex industry. It is a stark reminder that even with advanced technology, the choices made in boardrooms and design labs can have profound and devastating consequences on human lives. The trade-offs made for the 737 MAX serve as a permanent lesson in aviation history.